Hi there. Hello and welcome to the Earth and Space Sciences Colloquium. My name is Kate Huntington and I'm a professor in this department. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, ESS Distinguished Lecture Series speaker, to be specific, Isabel Montanez, who is a distinguished professor and Chancellor's Leadership Professor of Geosciences at UC Davis. She's also the director of the UC Davis Institute of the Environment. So Dr. Montanez is a paleoclimatologist whose research focuses on geologic archives of past atmospheric gas and ocean geochemical compositions and how they link to climate and ecosystems and their changes. And from field geology to geochemistry, Isabel brings deep expertise to all of these problems, as well as vision and strong leadership to address these important questions about the Earth system and its past and our future. She's received numerous awards, including the James Lee Wilson Medal for Excellence, the Pettyjohn Medal from SCPM, the Sloss Award, and the Day Medal from the Geological Society of America, the Jean-Baptiste Lamarck Medal from the EGU, and she's also a fellow of many professional societies, including AAAS, AGU, et cetera, and a past fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation. But of all of her accolades, I was really happy to see that she had won a UC Davis-wide teaching award, which I think is really in line with the mentorship and sort of support for the next generation of scientists and science communication that I've gotten to know as her hallmarks. She's her leadership extends also to having been president of the Geological Society of America, and she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, where she's had many leadership roles advancing science and in service to our nation. And so I'm just thrilled that we get to have her with us today, so please join me in welcoming Isabel Montanez to our department.
All right, thanks, Kate. I was going to chastise all of you for sitting all in the back, and then Kate told me that you actually can't see the screen if you sit further down. So I want to say thank you for having me, and some of you might remember that I actually was going to come this time, precisely this same week last year, and I'm glad to see that the union support of the students actually was delivered and that that they are represented. It's been a great day. I've really enjoyed talking to everyone, and in particular the students, so I thank you for sharing your time. So I was debating what to present today, and I had three things, and I said that's just too much. So I chose two, and I realize now I may have chosen the second one might not have been the right one, because I forgot Tyler Kukla is involved with the department and has recently talked to you about enhanced rock weathering. So you're going to hear more, but from my perspective. But I'm going to start by really talking about some of the more fundamental research that I've been involved in. And basically, the carbon cycle has been something that I've been interested in for most of my career, and in particular, reconstructing atmospheric CO2, finding new ways to do it and to do it better. And the whole thing is really driven by wanting to understand the Earth system's response to change. So today, I'm going to present in three parts. And the first one is very brief. I'm just going to talk about CO2 of present day and the future in the geologic context, because as you'll see, really we've never been in these conditions that we are in today for a long, long time. And then I'm going to pivot to talk about a international group, the CO2 PIP, that stands for CO2 Proxy Intercomparison Project. It's an international consortium that I lead, that Kate Huntington is one of the co-PIs, and that involves many people around the world, and we're really trying to advance the science of CO2 reconstruction and to build the next generation CO2 curve for at least through the Mesozoic and hopefully ultimately into the Paleozoic. Then I'm really going to pivot and talk about the long-term carbon cycle, briefly from the perspective of how is it that, in particular, silicate weathering and what we are learning about its control on how closely climate and CO2 are coupled. I'll give you an example of how some work we've done has helped us to resolve a paradox in a long time ago, 300 million years ago. And then I'm going to show you how we're using that knowledge and translating it to applied science, which is enhanced rock weathering, with the idea of applying it to climate mitigation. I keep forgetting I have this. Okay, so understanding how CO2, what the concentrations were in the past and how they changed is really critical to understanding the evolution of the Earth system. And you know this already, it's because atmospheric CO2 is intrinsically linked to planetary function. And you're probably aware that CO2 today is 423 parts per million, and that in this context, and what we anticipate for the not so distant future, this has analogs only in the deep past. So this is illustrated in this diagram, and I hope you can see this, but I'll walk you through it. What you're looking at here on the far right are the socioeconomic scenarios for different CO2 emissions, anthropogenic CO2 emissions through this century. And you're familiar with that from the IPCC. There we are today at 423. And then this is the CO2 range with the same axis for all for the last 800,000 years of the glacial interglacial cycles, and then extended to 60 million years ago, shown in two parts to the further to the left. And what I'm really trying to show with this is that if you look at where we are today, we now think we know that we have not been at this level of CO2 for 14 million years. And that really puts us back in time to be able to better understand what we might anticipate. And then if you look at the CO2 scenario that we are currently following, which is the yellow-orange one, we really likely will hit 500 parts per million, potentially by mid-century. And in that case, we are looking at CO2 levels we haven't seen for tens of millions of years, and potentially at levels that was before the stability of our major ice sheets today. So the message is that past greenhouses and icehouses that had CO2 fluctuations within this range that I just talked about have the potential to really inform us how life and our climate system will respond to such high CO2 that we can't get out of studying the more recent past. But ultimately, how well the past informs the future really depends on how well we know those CO2 reconstructions. And somebody asked me earlier, and I said, we don't know them that well. So let's look at that. This is, there's no shortage of CO2 estimates. I think we've figured out that there's on the order of 50,000 or so. This is just for the last 70,000 years, or much of the Phanerozoic. And the CO2 estimates are done by different proxy approaches. I'll talk about a couple of them. Those are shown here. And you can see that there's values all over the place, right? These are the published CO2 records. They were made using proxies that are summarized here. Bottom line is there are both marine and terrestrial proxies. For the marine, things like using the carbon isotopic composition of algae or phytoplankton, the boron isotopic composition of marine calcifying microorganisms. When you move to the terrestrial, often it involves looking at fossil cuticles, the waxy layer in leaves, and at times using their carbon isotopic compositions, and the chemistry of carbonates and organic matter in ancient soils. So there are problems with this CO2 record as it stands in terms of what was published prior to a compilation that came out in late 23. And that is that many of these estimates are semi-quantitative, and they're considered unreliable because they don't meet modern proxy theory. So we have mixing apples and oranges here. And what that means is that the uncertainties are under-constrained. They haven't been constrained by modern approaches. And often, for some of these, the community can't even agree on how to take the things that we measure, the proxy measurements, and translate that into a quantitative CO2 estimate. So a lot of work has been done to modernize and improve this record, and that was done by the first phase of the CO2 PIP consortium called the Phanerozoic CO2 PIP consortium, led by Beryl Honish from Columbia University. And what they did in the past decade was to take that Cenozoic, or 70 million years of data, and to modernize it. What did that mean? Well, on the top is all the data as I showed you on the last plot, everything that was published as is. And on the bottom is the same data set that has been vetted. What they did was to improve the uncertainties using comprehensive error propagation methods. They also vetted out some data, all the stuff in the background in gray that you can barely see. They said, forget it, we just aren't going to use that data. And so this is now the CO2 compilation as of 23 that we thought was reliable. And if you look at the change in the y-axis, you can see it's 2,500 ppm here, and it's 8,000 there. So the first thing you can take from this is that all those high CO2 estimates have been vetted out, right, of that Cenozoic data set. So this group then took these CO2 estimates and they said, and they used a statistically time-averaged approach to put together the latest curve for the Cenozoic that was published in Science in December 2023. And you can see that there are rises in CO2 during past hyperthermals. They correlate with changes in temperature. They also correlate quite nicely with changes in ice distribution and sea level. But I'm going to say something right now that is going to be sort of the focus of the rest of this first part, which is there are problems with this curve. Because this curve was based on CO2 estimates, not what we actually measure. And so if there are problems with the proxies, then there is bias in this curve, right? And so the second phase of the CO2 PIP consortium, which includes those original group, we are now working to address that issue. Before I go on to showing you what we're doing, I'm going to move back in time now to the entire Phanerozoic. And these are now the CO2 estimates that exist in the published literature. And when we use the same vetting criteria that we used for the Cenozoic and apply it to the Phanerozoic, then all the gray data points are vetted out, meaning we shouldn't even use them anymore. And I think you can appreciate there's a heck of a lot of gray on that database. So what do we know about the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic in terms of CO2? Right? It's kind of a little scary. And you can certainly see that all those high values, there's those high values from the Cenozoic, have been vetted out. So second phase of CO2 PIP started in 2021. This is the PIs. There are about 64 participants around the world that what we're doing then is three main things. Well, first what we're doing is herding the cats, and that's the hardest part. But once the cats are herded, we're building a standardized paleo-CO2 data repository. So we have these templates that have been developed for each proxy type, and all the data that's available in the literature goes into those, including age models available at the time, and they meet FAIR standards, and they are set up so that they can be updated by others in the future, and it can be tracked. So those are available on the NOAA website, presumably still, but they're also available on the Paleo-CO2 website and are still being uploaded. The second thing we're doing that wasn't done in the first phase is we're modernizing records where the samples are still available. And I'll give you some examples of what that involves and how much of a difference it makes. So it means updating age models, but it also means making more measurements and analyses, and then using this much more rigorous error propagation approaches. And probably most importantly, we're developing statistical and modeling tools that will allow us to essentially make a curve. It'll be a modeled curve, but it's data informed. And it'll be data informed by the proxy information that we measure, not by inferred CO2 estimates. This probably doesn't make a lot of sense now, but hopefully it will in about 10 minutes. But first, I want to take you under the hood of this process of CO2 reconstruction and just show you two proxies. and partly to show you how we do this, if you're not familiar with it, but also where are the limitations and how are we modernizing them to address that. So these are two examples, hundreds of millions of years old, of fossil leaves. And what you're looking at is the waxy cuticular layer that is incredibly well preserved, even as far back as the Phanerozoic. And the more solid brown or orange cells are the epidermal or skin cells, and the little circles or starlets are the breathing pores called stomata, in which the leaf takes in CO2 and releases water. So we've long known that plants optimize their stomata so that they can take in as much CO2 food as they need without losing too much water. So when it's times of low CO2, there are lots of stomata on any given species because they need more to take in food and keep them closed to minimize water loss. And vice versa, during times of high CO2, they need far fewer stomata. So a lot of the CO2 estimates that have been done are based literally on this inverse relationship, and then using modern extant plants to try to calibrate it. So what does modernizing mean? Well, initially it means having more detailed dimensions of the stomata, so they can be put into a proxy model, as well as the carbon isotopic composition of those cuticles. And then they're fed into the latest proxy model for using fossil plants. And what does that mean? Well, it is more comprehensive, and it is also more mechanistic in that it's based on a leaf gas exchange equation. And essentially, you're solving for CO2 by constraining three main parameters. One of them, A, is how much, what's the rate at which the plant is taking in CO2, stomatal conductance, how well is it conducting its water and CO2. And then this ratio is what was the CO2 in the plant versus the leaf versus the atmosphere. And believe it or not, these are actually worked out pretty well in greenhouse experiments so that we can actually measure things on those fossil cuticles that allow us to constrain these relatively well, and certainly with uncertainties. But this is an inverse proxy model, and you're going to hear me say that several times. Inverse means it is solving for the cause rather than the effect. And everything in nature, as we know it, a cause leads to an effect. I'll tell you what that means shortly. An inverse approach is reversing what is nature's way of doing things. And that's not a good thing. Here's another one. This one now is moving to fossil soils. This is a simplified equation of what we use to calculate CO2, but basically it is the carbon isotopic composition of carbonates, like this rhizolith around a fossil root, and then other parameters that we either measure or we have to infer. And there's a lot of uncertainty associated with this, and I'll point out the multiplier in particular we have no proxy for. So that has to be inferred. So this has been a problem with this proxy. To modernize it, working with Kate, we are getting clumped isotope temperatures, so a better sense of carbonate formation. That in turn helps us to better understand other parts of the soil system. We also are getting the carbon isotope composition of organic matter that's literally encumbered or occluded within these fossil carbonates, and that tells us with the temperatures, gives us a much better sense of some of these other parameters, like what was the carbon isotopic composition of the soil-respired CO2, and helps us to constrain that multiplier as to how much soil CO2 was there. So this is a step forward, but it's still an inverse model. So if you think about this model then, we're solving for CO2. That's the driver. That's the cause. Well, what business do we have by measuring or inferring, measured in blue, inferring in red? We're taking proxy measurements or inferences that are the effect, and we're saying, oh, we know precisely how the cause impacted the effect, so we can reverse that and get back at the cause. But what happens if there's multiple environmental parameters that are affecting the proxies that we measure? Then we have no way of constraining that. And that is the problem with inverse proxy models, which every model for CO2 reconstruction is an inverse model. So I want to show you, before I go to what's the fix and what are we going to do about that, I want to show you one effect of modernizing. So this is still using inverse models, but what if we go in and take somebody's sample set, they still have their samples, actually multiple people's samples, and we do some new analyses, and we use the best proxy models we have, and we estimate CO2. Does it make a difference? So this is what this diagram speaks to that. Age on the vertical, on the y-axis, and you'll see that there are two CO2 x-axes. This one is just scaled differently than this one, but they both intersect at 2,000 parts per million. So over here on the far left, the black curve and the uncertainty around it are about 100 paleosol carbonates and fossil leaf modernized CO2 estimates and their error. And then there are others that have been modernized that are not quite as comprehensive data sets. Those are the open green samples and the closed black squares. Some of those are actually phytanes from the oceanic records. Over here on the right is, you don't see the actual samples, but there's about 150 paleosol carbonates that are in the published literature. And that's the CO2 estimates that were provided for the late Triassic. And I think you can appreciate, just modernizing, you are halving the estimates of those values. But I think even more interesting is that if, in fact, our modernizing is one step towards better CO2 reconstructions, it suggests that the dawn of modern ecosystems and the appearance and diversification of dinosaurs didn't happen in a greenhouse world, as we've always said, but rather in a cool house with warm snaps. That's a very different Earth system. Okay, crazy diagram. I appreciate that, but I actually think it says what I need it to say. This diagram is to explain why this inverse approach is wrong, because this speaks to cause and effect. So here you are in a soil system, and you're going to have pedogenic carbonates, or you're going to have cuticles to work with for CO2 reconstruction. That's going to be all this stuff down here that we measure. CO2 is only one of the environmental parameters or physiological parameters that affect these things down here that we measure. It's not just CO2. And all of these arrows through the soil system, through the vegetation system that ultimately imprint the proxy are showing how many different things are imprinted on that proxy. So how can we take measured values, whether it's the ocean or the land, and calculate back easily, linearly, what CO2 was in the atmosphere? You can't, right? There's real problems there. So what is the answer? And the answer is forward proxy system models. And so these provide a mathematical representation of this diagram for each proxy type. It has all of the environmental, physiological, physical parameters, as well as so processes and conditions. And it then works in an integrated fashion to decide how are those imprinting what we measure in the proxies, and how can we then back calculate out CO2. So we in CO2 PIP are developing these forward proxy models for each of the CO2 proxies from the marine and the terrestrial realm. Here's one that was published just last year. This is for the boron isotope proxy in the marine realm. And it's to show you how the forward proxy system model works. You have environmental and physiological, or whatever you want, parameters that are input. They can come from climate models, knowledge about taxonomy, so on. Those are sampled by Markov chain Monte Carlo repeatedly. And then they feed into the forward proxy system model. It's essentially a fancy box model that is showing all of the processes. And it puts out a predicted proxy distributions, right? And then those are compared to the measured proxy values. And essentially, how well the measured fit the model results defines a posterior sample of model states. And because this is all embedded in a Bayesian inversion hierarchical model, this then feeds back into itself about 100,000 times. And each time that those posteriors feed back in, they basically condition the initial values till the model knows what fits best with what's in the actual measured values. And for CO2 PIP, the new CO2 curve that we plan to publish, I think we're on track for mid-2026, maybe late 26. We're going to do these for all of the proxy system models, but it's all going to be integrated into the one Bayesian inversion model. And the idea then is that everything has to fit. They have to be complementary to one another or there's a problem. And we will produce a data-informed but modeled CO2 curve. And we call this joint proxy inversion. So that's what I wanted to let you know. I wish I had results to show you beyond what I did, but stay tuned. I hope we have a great curve, or you'll never hear from us again about this. Okay, so I'm going to pivot and to the long-term carbon cycle, which I know all of you know about. I have two goals in mind in doing this. The first is to just very briefly show you how we use essentially silicate weathering and our improving understanding of how it closely couples climate and CO2 to resolve a paradox, a CO2 paradox in the late Phanerozoic ice age. But then I'll mostly talk about how this knowledge, this fundamental scientific knowledge, is being translated to climate mitigation. And that is enhanced rock weathering, or silicate weathering, that we accelerate to remove CO2 at volumes and rates that are relevant to climate change. So I know you all know this model, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so this is a diagram, then the carbon cycle, the balances of sources and sinks in that cycle. You know that most naturally that most CO2 is coming from volcanism, and that it's weathering on land through the carbonic acid system, where carbonic acid made from CO2 dissolved in rain and or from pore waters and the soil-respired CO2, that then dissolves silicates and produces bicarbonate and carbonate, and that along with the cations that are released presumably get washed by groundwater and surface waters to the ocean, where marine calcifying organisms will then sequester that inert dissolved carbon for a long, long time, right? And we've thought for a long time that the primary driver here is water availability and temperature. And so presumably the higher temperature, more water, we're going to have more weathering. And that's why we've always considered this part of the carbon cycle as being Earth's persistent thermostat, that is what has constrained temperatures. But there's been some recent work that has suggested it's not that simple, and it's always the case. But it is about also, and maybe even mostly, about weatherability of the silicates. And what that means is how much of clean surfaces are available for weathering. So you need highlands, you need to grind it up to make it really available. Soils sitting in a floodplain are not going to be as active. But as importantly, it is its composition. The more mafic or iron and magnesium rich, the more kinetic energy it has for weathering. It's higher weatherability. And that means that CO2 and climate are coupled sometimes less strongly than other times through this silicate weathering phenomenon. So I'm going to show you in the next slides how we basically tested a hypothesis that changes in weatherability may explain what was previously an unexplainable 10 million year low in CO2 that we just couldn't figure out why is it there. So this is a CO2 for a 40 million year period of the late Paleozoic. This is glaciation, the extent of glaciation in the southern hemisphere at the time. I'm I'm just going to give you what you really need to see out of this. All of the estimates, any one dot is multiple samples, but they're done by these 3 different proxies, so it's multiple proxies. And this has been a smoothed out curve to show the long-term changes in CO2. And I think you can appreciate that there's this interval here. Generally, CO2 is ranging in this time period between what we know in the Pleistocene to what we anticipate in the future. Blue are intervals of CO2 in hundreds of ppm increments below the average for the record, which is 400 ppm. And so this is a 10 million year window, and that's going to be the enigma or paradox we're going to discuss. You might also see, you might say, well, look at all those ranges in the data. And I want to point out that much of that variability in those actual black data model points are because there are eccentricity, 400,000 year variability in that CO2 that we detrended from this. And that's why you see that noise in the background. Okay, so why is this a problem? Why is 10 million year low? You've got maximum ice sheets. Is that a problem? It is because we can't explain how it got there. So the 2 major sinks for CO2 at the time, the first is the coal-forming forests, the wetlands, the iconic lycopsids and tree ferns that led to most of the coal on Earth. That disappeared due to widespread aridification in the lower latitudes well before this 10 million year low. So those sinks aren't there. And at the same time, there was, and I forget, the other one is that you have these highlands, the central Pangean highlands that spanned the tropics at the time. And those highlands, we now know from dating, were already pretty well denuded by this time. So silicate weathering of granitic highlands, that wasn't probably the main driver. And at the same time, what these yellow bars show is the onset of large igneous provinces and major volcanism. So how do you have a 10 million year low with these conditions? And a lot of people were questioning whether this record was very reliable. And then just recently a paper was published, or last year, using boron isotopes of brachiopods using the same time period, and they showed exactly the same record. So we said, okay, can we test the hypothesis that a major change in the weatherability happened because of a change in the type of rock that was exposed to weathering? And could that have driven, despite the loss of those sinks and a new source, could that have driven this low? So the idea here is that prior to this event, we had these Pangean highlands. They're granitic primarily. They were weathering, pulling down CO2. And then at the peak here, we know that we had ophiolites that were exhumed along much of 10,000 kilometer long suture zone. And it was in the tropics. And that'll play into why it's important. So on the top map here, all of these lines, but I'm going to focus on the purple ones. These are suture zones that have ophiolites in them, arc-continent collision sutures. Now, these are for the Phanerozoic, and I want to point out that when you look at the modern day, most of that in purple is modern day, you're looking at mafic-rich, ophiolite-rich, high weatherability rocks in the wet tropics, and that explains why the silicate weathering and consumption of CO2 today in this range, in these watersheds, is 2 orders of magnitude greater than in the granitic watersheds outside of the tropics. And then when you go to the late Paleozoic, the orange are the ophiolite-rich zones at that time, and they're in the tropics. So we said, okay, so maybe that change from granitic-dominated lower weatherability to ophiolite-dominated high weatherability, could that be enough to draw down that CO2? And we modeled it. So we used GeoClim, which is a combined carbon cycle and atmospheric GCM GCM model. And you see here modeled steady state. These are on millions of years, atmospheric CO2 for pre the 10 million year CO2 low in blue, the CO2 low in gray, and then post it in white. And in blue is for weathering of your typical granitic-dominated highlands at the time. And you can see that pre the event, it can explain, with CO2 that we're seeing. The yellow, green, and red are for 2, 3, and 4-fold more increase in the mafic to felsic ratio of what is being exposed and weathering. And before the CO2 low, even a 2 times increase, and you're in snowball Earth conditions, which are untenable. And when you get into that low CO2 nadir, in the dashed lines are the modeled CO2 threshold for ice, to sustaining ice. And you can see that all of a sudden it's only the green and red, so 3 and 4 time increase in the mafic to felsic ratio. That weathering of that is the only thing that can keep you below that ice threshold. And clearly we're at peak extent of the continental ice sheets. So we think that this does support this idea that we had a major shift in not the amount of weathering, but in what was weathering, and thanks to that weatherability difference between those types of rocks. Okay, now I'm taking on the time machine, we're going all the way to today and into the future. And so this one I probably have to, what you're looking at is a little video. On the left is we're putting ground basalt into one of our field trials for enhanced rock weathering. And so you can see the green material coming out. This is one of our sites. It's a cropland. And the idea, I know you've now heard this, and maybe you read about it, but I'll say it again. The idea behind this then is that an alkaline basalt ground up, amended to the top of the soil, tilled in our case, to about 10 centimeters. When that weathers, it will release calcium, magnesium, other metals, and it will take out protons, and then will release bicarbonate and carbonate, right? And in the process, the carbonic acid system in the soil is shifted a bit. You hope that this alkalinity is then taken out of the soil system into the groundwater, streams, ultimately the ocean, so it can be sequestered out of the atmosphere. So how does the CO2 removal from the atmosphere factor in here? Well, CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and or from CO2 in the pores of the soil because that carbonic acid system has shifted, and it wants to shift back to equilibrium. And to do so, it takes up more CO2, and it keeps the system going. Okay? There's something else about enhanced rock weathering is that, so here's an equation for phosphorite that is often a main constituent of basalts. It is of our basalts. It's showing the weathering, and what it's showing is that for every mole of the mineral weathered, you have the potential to take out 4 moles of CO2, right? Then that's pretty amazing. There are other co-benefits of this that are even getting more attention these days than the actual CO2 removal. Healthier soils, we're finding the higher infiltration capacity. It's neutralizing the soils, often around 6 or 7, which actually then it maximizes the availability of micronutrients to crops. So perhaps more crop yield. Still to be proven. And then for some cases, they're showing reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the soils. So co-benefit. And if Tyler's here, there you are. He will recognize this. Of course, there's huge uncertainty. And the markets for carbon removal are way ahead of the science. And so what this shows is that the uncertainty in the estimates of how much CO2 is being removed is 4 orders of magnitude of uncertainty. We don't know, right? Sorry, Tyler, I wasn't supposed to pitch it that way. Okay, so I'm going to show last 10 minutes or so, maybe 15. I'm going to talk about our trials, and I'm really excited about them because ultimately I'm a researcher at heart, and what this is allowing us to do is to take some really novel fundamental scientific research and really have fun with it, basic research, while we're actually playing in the climate mitigation world. And that'll be the last few slides. Okay, so these are sites in California. I am the director of what is called the C4NS, the California Collaborative for Natural Climate Change Solutions. We've been running trials in California since 2019 under a different name. We had these, you can see our different sites. All of them have rock amendment, but they also have, in many cases, an organic amendment. Compost, or in some cases, the fire symbol is biochar. Now we are part of a much larger consortium called Terraforming Soil that is led by Lawrence Livermore National Lab and involves a lot of different institutions, but also for-profits and non-profits. And this group is particularly interested in what is the benefit or antagonistic relationship of enhanced rock weathering with organic carbon sequestration in these working lands, or ultimately forests, such. And the idea here is that when you are weathering basalt, you often make secondary minerals. They could be clays, or they can be these poorly crystalline iron, aluminum oxyhydroxides, or colloids. And these things, as you'll see here in these SEM photographs, here's the secondary clay, they form repositories for organic carbon. And when a mineral can armor the organic carbon, we call that MOM, or MAOM, which is mineral-associated organic material. And it becomes much more durable. It doesn't oxidize. Microbes can't get at it as easily. And you can see that in soil systems that MAOM is the largest component, but it's also the slowest cycling carbon reservoir. That means it has a lot of potential for sequestering carbon as well, not just the enhanced rock weathering. So if the two together, you can see where I'm getting, right? That you have a lot of potential. However, adding rock to a system messes up the microbial ecosystem, and sometimes it's antagonistic and sometimes it's synergistic. So we're trying to figure that all out. But we also see that microbes often enhance the weathering. So there's lots very complex. I want to focus on one site because this is where we're using some novel isotopes to really track the weathering and the fate of the weathering products in the system. So this is an aerial photograph of one of our rangeland sites. And I'm really showing you here just how we have our trials designed. There are plots that are arranged randomly along with control plots in red. Some will have just rock, some have just compost, some have both, and different colors. And then we also have these 2 half-acre plots, one that is amended and one that is not, and I'll refer to those shortly. But we are measuring everything on these plots, and as well as our other trials. We look at the gas fluxes, both above the ground and in the soil. We look at soil properties. We look at soil carbon and or inorganic carbon, organic carbon and nitrogen, and the crop properties and micronutrients. The idea is we want to understand the whole system to be able to better constrain the weathering. So I'm going to just briefly show you some early results from the first phase of this work that I think we're doing a much better job now in our second phase based on all the mistakes we made and have all the lessons learned by us and others. But what you're looking at here then is the lysimeter waters. You're looking at bicarbonate alkalinity at 2 depths in the soil, 15 and 30 centimeters. And the thing you want to look at here is that what's in green and purple and light gray, those are amended plots with ground rock. And in dark gray are the non-amended or control plots. So bottom line is we can see just in 2 years the weathering of the basalt, right? You're probably seeing this trend, and you're thinking, what's that? Well, this was the 2 worst years of a 22-year drought in California. And so we're evaporatively concentrating. All right, this is another site. So this is a cropland site. This is a rangeland site. Same story, but these are shown a little different. And what I really want to point out here is here's the control. Here's the bicarbonate alkalinity, or DIC here. The control versus the rock-amended plots, but it's when you have both organic amendment and rock amendment that you're seeing the most change. So suggesting it's a synergistic set of processes. These were initial results. So back to our plot. Phase 2, we started 2 years ago, and we said, or a year and a half ago, and I said, we have to do better. We have to be, everything needs to be comprehensively monitored, and we need to do this consistently with all the other ones as part of this consortium around the country. So we're using this site in particular, and these 2 half-acre plots to really try to track the fate of the weathering products and what happens under the hood, under the top of the soil, before it is released to the streams or to the groundwater. So this site, these half-acre plots are on a slope of about 12 to 15 degrees, and that is cool because the hydrology, water moves fast in this, so we can kind of accelerate the whole model, or the whole experiment. We have flood irrigation at the top that comes from a nearby reservoir, and we control how much water, when, and so that's the top, the source. And at the end of the soil system, there's a stream, and that stream feeds into groundwaters. And so essentially, we have a downslope source to sink. And that's what's shown on this landscape diagram. Here we are where we irrigate, and that's the source. We can track that through the soil and out the soil system into the stream, source to sink. But soils are complex. They're chemical sponges. There's a heck of a lot going on under the surface of the soil. And primarily, you have a lot of exchange of cations that are getting absorbed to already existing exchange sites, or you're producing new ones by forming neoformed clays as products of the weathering, and iron hydroxy oxides. So the whole point here is you might be weathering up here, but what comes out the other end might not mass balance because you are temporarily storing or permanently storing your cations in the soil system, and that is messing with your carbonic acid system and messing with how much CO2 you really are removing from the atmosphere. So what we're working on now that I'm really excited about is we're saying, let's put novel isotopes to this. Let's see if we can track the things from the weathering, like strontium and lithium, maybe magnesium. We talked about that today on one-on-one talks. And see if we can track source to sink, but also deconvolve all this complexity under the hood. So the first thing is that the sites, these are these half-acre plots. They are comprehensively monitored. I'm not going to go through that, but you can see every gas, every water is being measured. 4 times a year, we go in and we also get soil samples. But what's cool about this site is that at the base of or the exit of the soil system to the stream, we have built these trenches or sampling systems. It's a 3-layer system that actually taps each of the 3 layers in the soil here at the base of each of these plots. And we not only can then capture quantitatively the flow rates, but we can also capture the water and store it for later analysis. So that means the water system is highly constrained, and we can really, and then, of course, the soil system as well. So briefly, what are we doing? We're using triple strontium. That means we're using radiogenic strontium, 8786, because it's a very conservative tracer of a weathering of a feedstock. Here's the feedstock, or the basalt at this site, because there's no fractionation. It doesn't matter if you're making secondary minerals or you're having exchange, and none with biotic processes. What does this diagram show? All of the sources of strontium to this soil system. So that's all being measured quarterly, as well as all the waters and soil samples. Very comprehensive. And this is just an idealized, what would we expect to see downflow in the waters versus in the soils when we measure them quarterly per year. But the way we're doing our strontium isotope analyses, we get 2 for 1. We also get stable strontium, and that is 88 to 86. And that doesn't fractionate when the basalt is weathering, but it does fractionate when secondary calcite is forming. And the lighter, the 86 is preferentially taken into the calcite, and so presumably the waters will show increase that will tell you you're forming calcite. But what is really cool about that is that the precipitation of calcite and the fractionation is rate dependent. And it's a big change with how much is forming. So we're going to use this see if we can get at that CO2 threshold or that saturation threshold at which calcite starts to precipitate before we can see it in the soil system by any other means. And that's pretty important because, you put in calcite, you're taking some of that sequestered CO2 and you're permanently removing it. So what do we expect that soil profile to look like? Again, now it reversed, but the water versus the soil. And lastly, we're throwing lithium isotopes into the mix, and I hope after today, maybe magnesium. Why lithium? Because lithium is really complementary. It does not fractionate when you dissolve the feedstock, but it does when you temporarily store lithium and other cations on those exchangeable sites. And again, the reason we care about that is because by storing the cations, you're also messing with how much alkalinity is essentially, its fate. And so it not only then, so you can track that, but you can also track the fractionation due to formation of clays and iron oxyhydroxides. And taking you back to chemistry 101 or whatever, lithium has a much higher surface charge density than does strontium. That means this thing is moving around. It's happy to jump off and on of exchange sites, and its fractionation potentially could be much larger as it's taken up into clays and other secondary minerals. And that's shown on this diagram. This is the difference in the lithium of the solid versus the pore water in a naturally weathering system with depth. And you can see this very large change in the big delta that's showing all of that active lithium as it is undergoing these processes in the soil system. So what do we think the potential is in California? And I will say right up front, this diagram we made 1.5 years ago, and I've debated whether we should try to recalculate it. This probably means nothing anymore because it's probably too high. But back then, based on what we knew from our first phase of trials, we thought that we could probably do about scaling up in California, not just us, but scaling up in California, probably about 30 to 50 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And what is interesting is that that's the amount put out by the agricultural sector per year. But California has a regulation called SGMA that's about to go into effect, where basically 3 to 4% of our land, at least 1 million, maybe 2 million acres, have to be decommissioned from working lands because of water restrictions, and they're going to become grasslands. And so if you put those in the mix, then this could increase considerably, and it could account for basically residential, commercial, and agricultural sector CO2 in California. Now, I think these are over-predictions, but we'll know. Globally, these values vary. They keep coming down, but somewhere between 0.5 and 2 billion tons or gigatons of CO2 per year. And we're looking to take out that legacy CO2 probably about 10, is that about right, in the next several decades. So, a small part of it, but part of the whole mix. Okay, so to wrap up, I would argue that after years of working on a deep time Earth system and reconstructing CO2, and in the context of what is now the current and future, we have to appreciate that it is only studies of the deep past where we have database perspective that that's the only data. Anything for the future is based on projections models. So the two kind of have to be used together. There's room for the deeper time. And then realizing this potential, of course, means we have to do better at reconstructing CO2. And I think I shared that with you. And lastly, I think for the younger people in the room, I think there's, and Tyler can speak to this by full experience, there's a lot of potential out there, not just in this, but in other cool things like AI mining for critical minerals, and that need geoscientists, geochemists, modelers, that will be translating really fundamental scientific skills for societal problems, applied work, but that still allows you to be that researcher you want to be. So lastly, I'll tell you that I'm one of those people that I think sometimes likes dogs more than people. And so the real reason I think I love that rangeland site is because of Clyde here. He and his two buddies are out there always chasing the cows, and they're just great. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'll bring the microphone around.
Oh, yeah, here we go. I think I forgot. Did I turn on the microphone? I guess I did, yeah.
Stick around. Question back here.
Hi, great talk. This is all brand new to me, so maybe a naive question. Pertaining to the first part of your presentation about how you, the PIP, CO2 PIP, decided to do kind of a binary of throwing out some data, keeping some data, and then compiling them all together into a curve. But was there any weighted accuracy for any of the data points, or were they all treated equal? And if so, what is kind of considered more accurate versus?
Yeah. And I will say right up front, that Phanerozoic work is led by Bärbel Honisch, and that's where that credit should go. So what they did was to categorize, category 1, 2, and 3. That's how they vetted the data. Category 1 was able to be completely modern, not modernized, but the error propagation could be done reliably. And when you looked at the approach, it met modern proxy theory, meaning it was as good as we are doing. We couldn't do better. And the records were complete. You had all the data. You could really see what was the true metadata and data that went to those estimates. So they could be rerun with the error propagation. Category 2 were those that shouldn't necessarily be vetted out, that pedogenic carbonates. All the CO2 done with paleosols and pedogenic carbonates were in that. Sometimes they were even in category 3. What that meant was you could modernize a bit, but you didn't have enough information to be able to fully bring it up to modern proxy theory, the errors primarily. The ones that went into the curve are 1 and 2. 3 were all those that basically they said, and those are mostly the pedogenic carbonates. They are, a lot of it is that. There's other things too, but the alkanones that were done for the Phanerozoic, they're all in there. And the bottom line was, we know the proxy model isn't right, but we can't fix it, not in this, not now. And so those were just removed, yeah. And so this time around, we were going to do that. We were going to put out individual Mesozoic, Paleozoic curves first that way, and even some highlights. And then at a workshop in September last year, we said, why are we doing that? It's just propagating bad science in a sense. So let's just do one paper when we're really ready to do the whole thing. And that'll be the curve we'll come out with from the forward proxy system modeling in the Bayesian inversion.
Great, thank you.
Tyler, you don't believe any of this stuff, do you?
Thanks. So interesting. I love the forward proxy modeling. I'm curious how. So before you got to the forward proxy modeling, you were talking about incorporating like clumped isotope thermometry or other proxies to kind of constrain the error across multiple proxies. I'm wondering how those multiple proxies kind of are incorporated into the forward proxy modeling, so you can kind of get at that like Venn diagram of where you're overlapping and constraining things?
So this is work with Gabe Bowen. It's really his brainchild, and then we're the informers. How do you build these proxy models? So I'm also working with him on another project that I lead on. We call it the Stoufire Consortium. It's reconstructing climate fire behavior from stalagmites in the West. The reason I bring that up is there we're putting together a forward system, proxy model for karst system. And it has everything, biomarkers, stable isotopes, including calcium isotopes, radiogenic isotopes, the soil system, fluid inclusion isotopic data, trace elements. It's the comprehensive system. A lot less complex than putting together 8 or so proxy system models, right? But we're using the same approach. And we're further along on that one because it's more constrained. And it's really, we just had a workshop, our group and our students and postdocs in January, and it's nimble enough. We use JAGs to actually do to embed the forward proxy system models. And if you put in one or you put in, because that has components, put in 1 or 5, it takes more time to get the code right and to run it, but it's pretty straightforward, and so it's just iterating, essentially. So the boron one is working on this side, the cuticle one will work on this side, so on and so on, and then they are going to take their posterior states and compare, and if this one's saying 100 ppm, this one's saying 1,000, problem, out it goes, right, and then it's rerun. So they're kind of running independently, but then they have to confirm that they work. But what we are doing, because of that, what we discovered is, with the karst one, well, we can take all the terrestrial ones and put them together like a karst model, and all the marine ones and put them together. So that's what we're doing. It's sort of an in-between, right? But then we're going to use a supercomputer in the end to actually be able to do that run, where it's able to run through thousands of time steps and comparing all that.
Cool. Thanks.
Do you have any recommendations for those of us generating data these days so that in 20, 30 years they don't get pitched by the next round of modelers?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so, well, no. I mean, well, I think we have to, I guess what I have learned in the last, 5, 8 years or so in running these consortia is how much nicer it is when you work with these big groups. And sure, it's hard herding the cats, right? But when you do so, you have to share all the data and the metadata. And it forces people to bring their data sets where they're accessible to everyone. So in both of these consortium, we're producing these templates, these repositories. We're housing them or archiving them on our own website for that consortium, and then they go to the NOAA site. But the data's still there. It's just that we thought putting them on the NOAA site was the right thing to do, because that's where people have been putting these records. So they're still available, and those sites can't be brought down until, well, anything's possible. But right now, we think that they're safe, right? But I clearly don't have any idea how we're going to protect them. I do want to say one last thing, because the National Academy is running a consensus study right now. It's a short one. It actually came from Congress 2 years ago, and Kate will know about this because the board that we were both on was assigned this by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Did you even know there was a Bureau of BOEM? I didn't know that, or BOEM. But so it's safe because it's energy management. And what they are looking to do, I'm not sure why they got it, but Congress said, we need a repository for all data sets, maybe for all ice cores, all drilled cores, continental and marine, stalagmites, dendrochronology records, and so on. hazards, all geohazards, data and samples, would it be worth the U.S. government having a new agency that would be called the Center for Paleo-Environmental Extremes? And so far, that consensus study hasn't been closed. A lot of others have been, stop work orders. And the idea there is they did before past November, they put 800,000 into the consensus study, and they're talking about putting 80 million a year into this new center. Is it going to happen or not? But it's interesting that it's still going, and it was by the Republican, that same Congress that actually mandated this. And that would be the repository. That would be the idea behind it.
So, oh gosh, and there are more questions. Okay.
One here?
Two, yeah.
Right down here. I can give you my
Start
microphone.
Shouting, Michelle.
Can I just check? Okay. Great. Thanks so much for the great talk.
Yep.
Really enjoyed it. I am an igneous petrologist, and I was really inspired by thinking about kind of community consensus around databases and different proxies. Several times you referred to modern proxy
Theory?
And I was curious, has there been some kind of fundamental paradigm shift in the field? And that's what, defines modern proxy theory? Or is it kind of like a cutoff about what is considered modern theory and what's considered no longer adequate?
Yeah, so it is that the first phase of CO2 PIP, they defined that here as could the errors be quantified fully, and or could records be modernized, updated, that then would have all of the measurements necessary to use the most up-to-date proxy models, inverse proxy models. So they defined that, and that was their category 1, 2, and 3. And so their paper in Science was, short time in the typical science paper, but I think the supplementary online materials are 80-some pages of text, which is all explaining all of how they defined that for each proxy.
Last question, if you still had it.
Thank you. I was wondering how you think about and or account for the energy going into the amendment experiments and obviously the CO2 that might be created by making that energy.
Yeah. So the first phase actually did have a life cycle assessment with it. And that was okay because we used metabasalt, which was not good. And that came from a quarry not very far away. It actually is Cretaceous rocks that have clays that we actually did paleo temperatures on 20 years ago. So it was kind of funny, right? Go back to the same quarry. The reason that the CO2 footprint for the production, the grinding, the mining and grinding of that metabasalt wasn't high is because it was already mined. And these were the granules left over from a company that makes roof tiles. You know, the granules on roof tiles? This was the leftover material. And so it was only shipped, I think, 50-some kilometers, and then it was already ground. These trials, no way. But what we decided as a consortium, this terraforming soil group across the country, we said, look, we've probably got 1,000 acres. Oh, more than that, because Noah Planowski has thousands of acres. We have a few thousand acres on these trials across the country. Let's be really consistent with our strategy. So we decided to all use the same basalt coming from Sunrock Quarry in Georgia. So, that just blew out of the water the CO2 removal or the benefits, right? But these are experimental for being able to quantify, get those uncertainties down. But yeah, absolutely has to be factored in. And I think those who have done estimates are generally saying, 50, 60 kilometers outside of your trial, and you're shipping in anything more than that. But there's some other cool stuff, and Tyler, I'm sure, can talk about this more than I can, but like one of the people who initially gave us materials to use, we ended up not using, was actually the the pot farming community, greenhouses in Colorado and in California, Oregon, they use basalt steel wool, essentially in their greenhouses, almost hydroponic. And so they aren't using them more than a couple of cycles of growing because the nutrients aren't there. And or they didn't feel they wanted to mess with the results of what they get in their very carefully designed plants, right? And so they were going to give those to us, and we were really kind of excited about trying that. And then we said, we should stick to ground rock at this time. But so there are other options that may be out there for use that will lower those emission components.
Fabulous. Okay, let's all thank Isabel again.
My pleasure.